Assalamu alaikum and good evening. My name is Yusuf Ismail and the program you're watching is I Beg to Differ. This is a program which focuses on contemporaneous debate on socio-economic, political, cultural and religious issues affecting us as South Africans and looking at some of the global trends in the international community and its impact on us. Last week we discussed the pernicious phenomenon of Islamophobia. Today we look at another concept which has acquired popular sentiment and usage in the mainstream media, and that is the concept of jihad. What is jihad? Is it really holy war? Is this a core teaching of Islamic theology which calls upon Muslims to go march and massacre non-Muslims? Well, debating this particular concept, I'm joined in the studios once again for part 2 of this ongoing discussion with Adnan Rashid, a historian from the United Kingdom who studied at the School for Oriental and African Studies with a specialization in Islamic civilizational history. Welcome again, Adnan. It's good to have you again. Let's go back. This idea of jihad, people don't understand it. It's generally, conventionally equated with the term holy war. Yet you probably know that in Arabic, the word holy is al-muqaddas, harb is war, al-holy war, al-harb muqaddas. What does jihad mean? How did this concept acquire the misnomer of being simply limited to holy war?
Holy war is a Christian term which was used for the Crusades, and when
Pope Urban II, right?
Yes, exactly. And when Christians studied Islam with their Christian lens, they saw their Christian terminology and everything Islamic. So for that reason, the term holy war is not a good term to describe the concept of jihad in Islam. Jihad actually linguistically means struggle, to struggle. And this struggle comes in a number of forms. For example, there is struggle by pen, there is struggle by speaking up, like using your tongue. There is struggle by hands, there's struggle by fighting. So sometimes to defend the poor, the weak, the oppressed, if you struggle with your hands, led by the leader of the country, the state, then that is also regarded as jihad, and it is a very noble concept in Islam. Very often it is equated with terrorism, which is what we can talk about in due course. Jihad is not terrorism, and terrorism is not jihad. Jihad has set rules in Islam.
They're two mutually exclusive terms,
yes.
And yet they're viewed and presented as one and the same thing.
Yes.
And the point you're basically making is that from the Quranic perspective at the very least, it's universal in its usage. Would I be correct in suggesting that it is it's generic?
Yes.
In the sense that, for example, a classic thing that comes to mind is Surah Luqman, when it speaks about the polytheistic parents compelling you to engage in acts of shirk. You do not obey them in acts of polytheism, but you bear them good company in this life. But the word used in compelling or engaging in a form of duress to force you to engage in polytheism is وَإِن جَاهَدَاكَ عَلَىٰ أَن تُشْرِكَ, that if they compel you. So the root word from which you can get the word jihad is used.
Yes.
So the Quranic terminology where jihad occurs in its various forms and manifestations very universally based. Why has that not been picked up, not caught on in the public mind, in the academic mind, when they've limited just simply to the issue of holy fighting?
It is partly because the Muslims use the term jihad to describe military interventions or military actions. So Muslims have historically, classically used the term jihad for military action.
Was it a misnomer?
It is, It
is in a sense actual struggle, jihad,
yes,
physical fighting.
That's right.
But to kind of make it mutually exclusive, or limit the term itself to just simply fighting, divorces it.
Yes,
from
other meanings.
From the other
other meanings, which is, there is another term used by the Prophet in a hadith that the greatest struggle is to struggle against oneself, right? So that's also a struggle to suppress your...
We've come from the lesser jihad to the greater jihad.
Exactly. That report is there, although some people doubt the authenticity.
They say that hadith is not authentic.
Yeah, but the meaning is correct.
The meaning is clear.
One's greatest struggle is against his desires, is against his passions, especially if those passions are not
they
legal.
Need to be kept in check.
Yeah, exactly. What we call jihad al-nafs. Yes. Controlling your nafs, controlling yourself, your desires, your passions. So jihad is a generic term, as you rightly pointed out, but technically in Sharia, when the term jihad is used on its own, it usually means armed struggle for justice. Armed struggle for justice. It cannot. Jihad can never be for oppression, for terrorism, for the killing of innocent people. Never, because it is not jihad. It is not jihad. So, jihad against innocent people is an oxymoron.
It's an oxymoron.
It's an oxymoron. Yeah, it's like a square triangle. It's black-white. Okay.
And that's a crucial point that
yes,
you're making.
Yes.
So in a general, just if you were a quick summary then, jihad could basically be understood, broadly speaking, as a struggle for righteousness.
Exactly.
And the struggle for righteousness obviously can take its manifestations in various forms. Speaking truth to an oppressive leader, actual struggling in one's own life.
Absolutely, very good point.
Standing up, for example, in a defense of war against tyranny and oppression.
No,
and
that hadith you just mentioned, that's very, very interesting, where the Prophet said, Afdalul jihad, kalimatu haqqin, inda sultanin jair. The best of struggles. And the term here is jihad, and it's not. The Prophet is not talking about armed struggle. He's talking about the struggle of raising your voice in front of oppression. So the Prophet said the best of struggles is to speak the truth in front of a tyrannical ruler. Amazing. So the term here is jihad. So this hadith in itself, this prophetic tradition highlights the fact that jihad is a generic term used for struggle in Islamic literature. But it also means armed struggle, which is the common meaning taken by Muslims and non-Muslims in most cases.
Could we basically say that, and maybe this may be a controversial aspect, but I'm going to ask it, that when Muslim jurisprudence, when fiqh, acquired, as some would argue, its systematic juristic form during the Abbasid period, it incorporated de facto the logic of Muslim imperialism of that particular time. So, for example, since the Muslim rule was very much in its expansionist phase, terminology within the Islamic worldview, concepts were then kind of relegated to, for example, certain aspects, certain facets. And so when, for example, the state acted in a very militaristic style, then obviously certain concepts were appropriated, and the same thing happened with the whole concept of jihad, whereby it then basically acquired its kind of limited understanding of scope within the fiqh literature.
Your point is partly valid, but there are nuances. There are nuances. I think the nuance is when problems arose, questions were asked, answers were required. So the jurists at the time, they started to look for answers, and to seek answers, they went to the Quran and the prophetic tradition, and they found answers. For example, if a ruler wanted a fatwa, a ruling on a particular campaign, he would go to the scholars and he would ask them to deliver a ruling. So the scholars would sincerely go back to Quran and the prophetic tradition and find answers. For example, the issue of taxation was raised during the Abbasid period. Qadi Abu Yusuf, one of the greatest students of Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullah alayh, wrote Kitab al-Khiraj in response. So scholars didn't have this knee-jerk attitude towards Islamic jurisprudence. Rather, they answered questions.
There's an inherent flexibility based on the circumstances and conditions of the day.
Yes, indeed.
And then this takes us to another issue. Was there an abuse? Did abuse happen in Islamic history?
Yes, of course, there are many cases of abuse, and this abuse was not due to Islamic rulings. This abuse was due to personal vendettas, personal greed. Some rulers were better than others, and others were worse than their predecessors. So many rulers committed atrocities, but not all the Muslim rulers. Generally, if you look at the Islamic civilization, it was a great thing. It was a great achievement. Western scholars, Western historians who have studied the Islamic civilization, they have praised the Islamic civilization for its tolerance, its coexistence, its convivencia, to use the classical term used by Spanish Arabists to describe the coexistence between three Abrahamic faiths,
Jews,
Christians and Muslims in Islamic Spain. Spain was governed for nearly 7 centuries. Parts of Spain were governed for nearly 7 centuries by Muslims. And what happened during that age? It was called the Golden Age by the Jews, because the Jews flourished.
I mean, you had Jewish physicians, for example.
Physicians, philosophers, poets, theologians. Musa bin Maimonides was born.
Was it Jewish?
Yes, he's called the second Moses by the Jews. He was the most important man after Moses himself.
In fact, they say that the peak of Jewish civilization
Was in
at
Spain.
its heights in Muslim
Yes,
Spain.
absolutely. And likewise, Christian scholars flourished within the Muslim domain, and they coexisted happily. So Islam, the Islamic civilization at large, was a positive thing. Did atrocities happen? Did they take place? Yes, we have Timalanes, we had Baburs, we had other
But I think
individuals.
that's indicative of all civilizations. for
Absolutely,
example.
absolutely.
And basically that's how civilizations, empires, you're obviously going to have abuse.
There is no
But
utopia in the real world.
utopia,
Yeah.
but the problem is that this is then presented as a norm. So this idea of the marauding Saracens coming and taking over Europe, that's always, whenever it comes to Muslim civilization history,
Yeah.
that's effectively presented as the norm.
Well, this is
as opposed to an aberration.
this is what prejudice does. What you do is, because you're looking for evidence to support your prejudice, you will naturally ignore everything that goes against your prejudice. So this is what Islamophobic scholars or Islamophobic Orientalists or Islamophobes, for that matter, have been doing recently. What they do is they selectively choose passages from Islamic chronicles, and they ignore all the other facts that go in.
Just the negative aspects,
Yeah.
atomizing these particular aspects in Islamic history, presenting this as normative, and then of course rejecting all the rest. One thing which is also quite disturbing in recent times is that traditionally in history, the Crusades, the pronouncement at Clermont by Pope Urban II, the subsequent Crusades and massacres that happened in Jerusalem, historically this has generally been viewed as a blight on Christianity, even by Christians who have acknowledged that. But I think this is a new trend, which is coming out extremely commonly. I don't know whether you call it revisionist material, where now the Crusades are somehow or the other justified. I don't know if you've come across this argument as a sort of a response to the previous 6 centuries of Muslim incursion, conquest, massacres, genocide that took place. So very much that this was a kind of an aggressive form of defense, where Christians were now basically being persecuted. They're now taking the initiative to go ahead and do away with the persecution. This is a new kind of theory, and the Islamophobes basically are presenting this. I see the late Nabil Qureshi, strangely enough, dealing obviously with his associations in one of his recent books, puts the same idea across, citing historically revisionist crusade scholars to justify their position.
You see, this position is usually used by missionaries and Islamophobes who have an agenda. They're not interested in academia. They're not interested in objectivity. They are interested in selective anecdotes from history to support their theories, right? So what they do is they go to 19th century outdated works and they pick up these theories
And
they try to normalize them today.
normalize
But they are completely ignored by mainstream academics and historians. They don't take them seriously because a lot of these theories were absolutely false.
Have you not come across any academics that have come across that are now presenting this idea that the Crusades was very much a defensive war?
There was an academic, or he's still alive, Jonathan Riley Smith, who is considered an authority on Crusades, who happens to be Catholic. He tried to justify the Crusades by saying that this was a way of Crusaders expressing their love for Christ or for their love for the Muslims. But how do you love someone by killing them? By killing them. So this was a problem. There are historians, but he's an exception. He's an exception. There are historians like Christopher Tyman. There is, there are other historians like Carol Hillenbrand who have even Stephen Runciman, although he has been outdated, he has been criticized for his approach, his traditional approach. There are many historians who challenged that narrative, and they declared Crusades to be barbarian invasions of the civilized East. And a lot of historians do see it like that. The Crusaders were effectively barbarians. We don't like to use these terms in academic writings, but
that's the reality.
But that's the reality. They were highly
those terms are used loosely as well in the writings of the Orientalists.
One medieval work in particular highlights this fact quite humorously, and that work is the writing of Osama ibn Munqidh, who was a contemporary author who looked at the Crusaders and described them. Of course, he had his Islamic prejudice. He had his Islamic lens through which he was looking at the Crusaders and their social norms. And he described the Crusaders in fascinating ways. He looked at the Crusaders and he saw them to be very shameless when it comes to moral, ethics. Yeah,
personality.
they were very shameless, and he described them as racist as well, very race-centric. They don't like to mix with others. Then he described them to be unhygienic, very unintellectual, things like that. Their medicine was primitive. So his Kitab al-I'tibar is very, very entertaining, and at the same time,
Has it been translated?
it has been translated by Paul Cobb and published by Penguin Press, and it is a very, very interesting book to read for historians as well as the masses if they want to look into a Muslim perspective from the Middle Ages on the Crusaders.
Fascinating, fascinating stuff. Well, we'll continue this discussion. We just have to go for a quick ad break, and we'll be back soon. Welcome back to I Beg to Differ. I'm your host, Yusuf Ismail, and with me in the studios for part 2 of an ongoing and fascinating discussion on jihad and whether it's equivalent to holy war. I'm joined by Adnan Rashid. Welcome back, Adnan. It's great to have you. We focus on the Crusades. I want to take us forward into the phenomenon of so-called Islamic terrorism, or terrorism as it's acquired its common definition, Islamic terror in the mainstream media. I want to look at it from the perspective of popular culture, that, when you look at some of the kind of Hollywood mainstream productions that existed in the 70s, in the 60s, a lot of the kind of the common enemy, the fictional enemy, were either the Indians. You had the issue of the cold threat. You look at some of the James Bond movies from the 60s. And you look at some of the movies by Sylvester Stallone, for example, in the early 80s, I believe one of them, Rambo, where he sides with the Mujahideen. I'm not so sure if you're familiar with that.
Yes,
I'm not too familiar with too much of these, but it seems that there's that from a popular culture type of perspective, in the public mind, certain sentiments were created as a sort of bogeyman, and then post 1990, 1992, 93, you then have in popular culture, for example, things like the siege, executive decision, and so on and so forth, where now the new threat is the so-called Islamic terror, the specter of Islam coming to take over society, and so on. Now, this shift, and we're talking purely, just purely from the perspective of fictional entertainment, but has had the sense of kind of conscientizing people into a particular direction, a particular form in terms of developing their own opinions. What kind of led to the shift?
Of course, political events led to this shift. I think Hollywood...
You say the 79 revolution in Iran, would that have been, in a sense, critical to... Suddenly, out of nowhere, you had the Shah of Iran, the revolution takes place, now we've got this new phenomenon, it's like Islam is back. We have to confront something new.
I don't think it was that particular revolution. I think this whole issue of Islamophobia, or what I call political Islamophobia, escalated after the first Gulf War. The Western foreign policy was supported...
91 Gulf War.
Yeah, 91.
Operation Desert Storm.
Yeah, when I say Western foreign policy, the coalition of Western countries, it was supported directly by Hollywood movies. So the justification and the humanization of the cause came from international media, in particular the Hollywood. Even the Bollywood is using these tactics to demonize.
I wasn't aware of that. Are they using that?
Absolutely, 100%. You see how the Muslims are depicted in some of the recent movies. Muslims are depicted, or the Muslim rulers of the past are depicted very negatively. They are shown as the enemy of India. They are shown as generally disturbed people, mentally disturbed people. For example, there was a recent movie made within Bollywood called Baji Rao. Baji Rao was a Maratha, general who is shown as a hero fighting Muslims in this movie. The Mughals
is this
and the Nizam.
The Mughal period?
Yeah, the Mughal period, the later Mughal period in the 18th century. Then there was something recently made about Padmavati, who is a mythical figure who didn't exist historically, but a story has been made out of her mythical tale that one of the Muslim kings, Alauddin Khilji, who was a historical figure, who did govern India for some time, he was crazy about her, and he invaded her territory, and he wanted to basically to get to her because he heard about her beauty. So to get to her, he invaded Hindu territory and destroyed. So these negative depictions of Muslims are happening even in Bollywood. Hollywood has been at it for a very long time. You know, there were movies like Under Siege, True Lies, where
it was very much in the 90s,
yeah,
right?
Yeah, where terrorists are shown using the word jihad for their movement. So jihad and terrorism has been shown as
And
interchangeable terms.
Interchangeable terms.
Yes.
And prior to that, probably in the 70s and 60s, if there were discussions on Muslims or portraits, they were very much as presented as primitive.
Yeah, very strange.
Oriental,
very strange. Yeah, this mysterious Eastern man.
Oriental man.
Yes,
basically.
that's right.
History of the Sheikh, was it Valentino? Was it Rudolph Valentino in the 1900s that presented this whole notion?
Yeah.
So it's quite fascinating from that aspect that it was Gulf War I, 1991. Then, of course, you had Gulf War II, 2002. You had the 9/11 attacks that happened, and then it just suddenly went haywire.
And a lot of these policies, these wars, were directly supported by the media, the mainstream media, BBC, Sky News. A lot of the intellectual impetus was provided by these media platforms, and Hollywood did an amazing job in justifying some of these wars by making movies on these wars. And some of the soldiers were humanized, you know, why they're doing what they're doing and what they're going through after these wars. So on the other hand, the enemy was dehumanized, all sympathy was taken away, as they say that when you want to kill a dog, give it a bad name. Right? So Muslims have been given a bad name for a very, very long time. Muslims are always seen as an alien entity. And it, again, as I said, it started in the Middle Ages. It continued during the Renaissance period. Then it went into the so-called Enlightenment period. Then it came into the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution period. And then it reached its peak in the 20th century. And then, of course, it was definitely challenged by Western historians, scholars and philosophers. They did challenge this approach towards Islam and Muslims. A lot of the historians who were objective in their approach, they came out and they challenged it. But the media, the power holders or the powerful elite that govern the West, for some reason has some kind of vendetta against this so-called Eastern civilization.
Have we in a sense internalized some of these images, Muslims, in the sense of the kind of phenomenon of extremism that you see, where certain individuals, primarily youth, a lot of them from questionable backgrounds, I mean, I look at some of the examples that I've got. Muhammad Amwazi, the individual known as Jihadi John, he was raised and educated in the UK. Two British medics who met him at a Syrian hospital described him as an adrenaline junkie. He had drinking expeditions in Africa. You had Muhammad Ahmed Yusuf Sarwar. I'm not so sure. Again, 2014, they traveled to Syria. And when I think MI5 went into their rooms and they found a book called Islam for Dummies and the Quran for Dummies, showing the limited scope in terms of the material that they have. Didier Francois was a French journalist. He was interviewed by Christian Amanpour. I think he was kept in ISIS captivity for about 12 or 14 months. And when he was questioned what motivated them, he said they didn't even have a Quran. This was on YouTube. Now, it seems to me that a lot of these individuals that are joining these extremist factions are themselves, from a religious perspective, totally bankrupt. They have a questionable kind of allegiance towards the Islamic world. They don't betray the kind of so-called religiosity that you would see from a traditional Orthodox Muslim. And a lot of them have questionable criminal backgrounds. I mean, the same thing with the Charlie Hebdo killers, the Kouachi brothers. Both of them, they were on the radar of French intelligence prior to the killings. And so there's a lot of these individuals are questionable. Yet they are presented as normative by those bigots and Islamophobes as engaging in Islamic. Explain this contradiction.
Well, there is this contradiction, and it's well planned, it is well orchestrated, it is well presented by the Western media. When I use the term Western media, I don't mean all media outlets. I mean most major Western media outlets.
There are obviously exceptions.
Yeah, of course. I'm talking about BBC, Sky News, NBC, Fox News, CNN, all these channels pump out.
Would BBC be, would you categorize BBC?
Yeah, BBC is the
as
most,
Fox?
I think BBC is the most influential and the most subtle one
It's
out
kind
of
of a
them.
subtle form of
Yes,
propaganda,
it is soft.
Not as
What we call,
overt as Fox.
yeah, what we call soft Islamophobia. BBC practices soft, subtle Islamophobia, not necessarily direct like Fox News, for example. Okay, but it is definitely in that category, which pumps out this narrative that this possibly is very Islamic, what's happening. As you rightly mentioned, that most of these individuals were possibly drug addicts, or they came from violent backgrounds and they loved violence for some reason and they wanted to just kill, and that's why they ended up in that place. So, and amazingly, so little are the examples of such people from the madaris, from religious institutions. Hardly any of these people came from religious institutions. In fact, if anything, most of them came from Western institutions. They went to Western academic institutions.
2005 London bombings, right?
Yes,
they were all
yes.
Western educated.
Yes, that's right. Now, we're not saying Western educational institutions promote terrorism. Likewise,
it debunks the notion that this is religiously mandated teaching.
Absolutely,
people to
absolutely.
engage
There is no link. There is no link. If there is a link,
Yeah.
there is a link between these individuals who are doing these atrocities and institutions they went to, if you want to make a link. But I don't think that link is fair.
Would you see that as a misappropriation of religion? Because Mark Sageman, who was a psychiatrist, I think worked with the Afghan Mujahideen, he wrote a book, I think, where he focuses, and this is a quote given to him by him. He says, religion has a role, but it's a role of justification. It's not why they do this or why young people go there. And when referring to ISIS, he, for example, says ISIS members are using religion to advance a political vision rather than using politics to advance a religious vision. To give themselves legitimacy, they use Islam as their justification. It's not about religion, this is what he says. It's about identity. You identify with the victims of the guys being killed by your enemies. So would it be correct in saying that rather than using religion, although they couch it in religious terms, it's actually a misappropriation of legitimate political grievances?
I agree.
There are legitimate political grievances.
Yes.
Bin Laden, for example, if you look at all his, or at least those that have been presented to us, more often than not, he talks about foreign policy. So it's a question of there are legitimate political grievances, and you've got these factions that are misappropriating them for their own particular use and propagandist purposes.
Yes, there is no doubt that there are legitimate grievances against Western foreign policy.
It's a misappropriation of the political grievance.
That's right, and Muslims are not the only people who are not so happy with the Western foreign policies. It is some of the Western thinkers and philosophers and academics and
the
politicians.
The anti-war movement. I mean,
exactly.
2000 and, when was it? 2003 in your country?
Yes. It's one of the biggest movements, one of the biggest marches in the history of Britain. 2 million people,
2 million people
took to the street.
Were you part of that march?
Yes, I was there. I was there personally. Yes, absolutely. So I consider myself part of the mainstream. I don't divorce myself from the British society.
Very much integrated.
Absolutely, very much integrated, and I love Britain. Britain is a beautiful country with beautiful people in it. But these people we're talking about, the fringe, they are actually a reactionary movement. They are reacting to the geopolitical events of their time. As you said, they are misappropriating religion. Okay, they have grievances, in some cases legitimate, but they don't know how to manage those grievances. Okay. You know, they are mismanaging these grievances, and they're using religion to support their atrocious
agenda and their propagandist campaign.
Absolutely,
okay.
Absolutely.
We have to go for a break, and we'll continue this discussion, this fascinating discussion, when we come back. See you soon. Welcome back to I Beg to Differ, and we debating and discussing a contentious issue, or something that has acquired a pejorative meaning in the mainstream media, and that is the concept of jihad. What is it? What does it entail? And what's the root meaning of this word? Welcome back, Adnan. We looked at some of these extremist factions from a theological point of view. The critique that is somehow or the other leveled against Islamic source, which is primarily the Quran, the prophetic paradigm, the Sunnah, the traditions of the Prophet, the Hadith, is that the texts justify violence. I think one of the key writers, Philip Jenkins, pointed out that if Christians or Jews needed biblical texts to justify instances of mass violence, they would have a problem of an embarrassment of riches. So it's very much a question of inconsistency is a sign of a failed argument or a double standard. That generally a lot of the critique against Islam being violent, being brutal, being cruel, comes from Christian evangelical missionary work, which is in fact an inconsistent position because their own particular source material is filled with aspects of violence far worse than any of the commands that are contained in the Quran.
Absolutely, no doubt. The Bible is full of verses where God commanded to commit genocide against
1 Samuel 15:3 against the Amalekites,
exactly.
In Numbers 31:17, the killing of the Canaanites, sex slavery.
And not only that, a lot of the atrocities that were taking place in Europe during the early modern period and then into the Enlightenment period, for example, witch burnings. Hundreds of thousands of women were burnt at stake throughout Europe for almost 3 centuries, from 1450 to 1750. Hundreds of thousands of women were burnt at stake, burnt alive. Now, where was the inspiration coming from?
Justify, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live, you know?
Yes.
Directly from
but
the
no,
Bible.
But burning, the idea of burning, where did that idea come from? That idea comes from the book of Leviticus. If a girl profaneth her father, who is a priest, then she is to be burnt.
We see a practical demonstration in the book of Judges where you have a lady coming, the man makes an oath to Jehovah, and then he subsequently burns his daughter that enters the front gate.
Yes. So we had all these things, you know, this historically all these events taking place in Europe. The inspiration came from the Bible, right? And for that reason, we turn to the Quran and we show the world or show the people who are criticizing the Quran for similar things. That link doesn't exist because when you look at the Islamic civilization, there are no witch burnings, there are no heretic burnings, there is no mass murder, there is no persecution. Of course, exceptional cases do exist, but throughout the history of Islamic civilization for over 1,000 years, you're not going to see pogroms. That wasn't the norm. Where pogroms did take place, that was the exception. And even in those cases, those pogroms are condemned by the Muslim scholars, because Muslim scholars made it very clear that the killing of the innocent people or the civilians or even burning of crops and trees and cutting down, even killing animals in conflict is not allowed. And they were taking this inspiration from the prophetic tradition directly. We have reports from the Prophet.
Commands prohibiting you from
absolutely. The Prophet Muhammad directly in authentic reports forbade killing of women and children, even in conflict, right?
Even in
so
conflict.
Targeting
mutilation of dead bodies,
bodies, cutting of the
birds,
absolutely,
crops, agriculture. There was an inherent concern in respect to this, and that takes me to a further thing. Recently, which I almost forgot to raise with you, there has been a book that has now attained popularity via Amazon, written by Spencer, a well-known Islamophobe, where he focuses on the history of jihad. He spends a significant amount of the book in which he presents irrefutable evidence, focusing on India. I think before we entered the discussion, we heard a few of the clips where he mentions, I think, Firoz Pasha, and he mentions some of the Mughal emperors, that there was a systematic act of mass murder and genocide towards a Hindu population by these Mughal emperors, destruction of temples, destruction of religious places of worship in the name of Islam. Can we have your counter response to that kind of... Where does it come from?
This attitude or this view of history, a very distorted view of history, comes from the colonial period when the British administrators who were governing India, they needed the masses to appreciate the government, and they wanted to present themselves as beacons of tolerance, right? Beacons of progression. And how did they do that? They showed the Muslim period as a very intolerant, disturbing, full of mass murders period.
Did they source that? Did they source that?
What they did was they selectively chose passages from
Muslim biographers and chroniclers.
Medieval Muslim chroniclers who deliberately inflated the deeds of the rulers of the time to pay tributes to them. And how would Muslim chroniclers pay tributes to their rulers? By exaggerating their jihad and their achievements in battle. Such and such ruler killed 100,000 enemies of Islam, or he destroyed X amount of temples and he broke X amount of idols. So this is how they paid tributes, and a lot of these tributes were actually highly exaggerated. Who says so? Modern historians. They have studied this phenomenon very carefully. People like Richard Eaton. Take temple desecrations as an example. Richard Eaton studied this topic, and where does this rhetoric actually come from? There is a commonality between this rhetoric coming from people like Spencer, who is in the US, highly funded, highly tolerated by the government, and has impunity for some reason to spread hatred against Islam and Muslims globally. And that is again distorting the history of Islam deliberately. This rhetoric comes from the right-wing Hindu nationalist element in India.
So you're looking at BJP, Vishwa Hindu Parishad, Bajrang Dal, the Rashtriya Swayam.
Absolutely, this is their rhetoric.
So here's the thing, let me get your position. Colonialists, British colonialists,
Yes.
in order to justify their brutal rule
Yes.
of killing and mass murder in India during the colonial period, justified the position that they were far more tolerant, far more helpful towards the natives of India.
Yes.
And they did this by appealing to classical Muslim biographers writing in India,
Yes.
who may or may not have exaggerated some of the deaths and the conquests
Yes.
by Mughal emperors in order,
Yes.
as a literary, would I be correct that that was a literary style of writing where people just simply, to assert power, you exaggerate the conquests.
The deeds of the ruler.
The deeds of the rulers,
and
to show power.
That's right. And this tactic or this strategy or this method of propaganda was used by many rulers in the past.
Sure.
to inflate their image, to
Make them seem more
yeah,
powerful.
to present themselves as the heroes.
In classic history, because if you look at, I think, Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars,
Yes.
There's talk that in his commentaries on the Gallic War, particularly the conquest of Gaul, there's a lot of exaggeration that is
100%.
contained there.
Absolutely.
And so on and so forth. So taking that into account, would the Hindu nationalists, I just want to, so we can get this clear, did the Hindu nationalists then appropriate this British writing
Yes.
that basically portrayed the Muslims as
There-
barbaric invaders?
Exactly. There was one particular collection in the 19th century compiled by Eliot and Dowson. It is known as the Eliot and Dowson collection, which has selections of Muslim chronicles where the Muslim chroniclers are talking about these wars and invasions of territories within India. In some cases Hindu states, in other cases Muslim states, right? So there were wars happening all over the place in India during the Middle Ages, right? So Eliot and Dowson collected all these unpleasant passages from Muslim chronicles. So what happened in the 20th century? Most modern historians of India have rejected that collection as a hodgepodge of inauthentic information, which was used to inflate the image of medieval
When
rulers.
was this popularized? When was this popularized?
This was
It would be post 48, right?
I would say not even 48. I would say this was popularized by a man called K.S. Lal, who was a historian, and he studied the chronicles of Delhi Sultanate and the Mughal period, and he again, just like Eliot and Dowson, chose these passages selectively, and now the Bajrang Dal and the BJP and the Shiv Sena are using that narrative to again support their cause or their xenophobia or the Islamophobia against
Does
the
the
Muslims.
present Indian government sustain the same position?
Absolutely. This
So
is
the
why
BJP of the present BJP administration holds on to the same position that
100%.
Mughals engage in genocide.
Yes.
So they want to introduce this,
Yes.
which was rejected by the vast majority of historians, into the mainstream.
Yeah, I'll give you one example. The figure of Aurangzeb Alamgir, the man who governed from 1658 to 1707, one of the most powerful Mughal emperors throughout history. And in fact, Aurangzeb's period was the richest period in Indian history, when India had 24% of world's GDP.
During the height of Muslim rule.
Yes, this was the height of Muslim rule. And Aurangzeb was a religious figure. He was a very good Muslim. And he was, again, a king who fought wars, and he subdued rebellions, and he did desecrate temples. Why were the temples desecrated?
That's a question. Why were temples desecrated, if
Right.
at all?
They were desecrated in all cases when it comes to Mughals for political reasons, not for religious reasons. I'll give you why. I'll give you the reason why. There were hundreds of thousands of temples within the domain governed by Aurangzeb Alamgir. Hundreds of thousands of temples. If he had an India-wide policy of temple desecrations, he would have destroyed possibly thousands of temples. The evidence we find is only few dozen temples destroyed by Aurangzeb Alamgir's orders, because those particular groups were rebelling against the king. Now Rajputs, who were also Hindus, were allied with Aurangzeb Alamgir. They were allies and they were Hindus. Their temples were not touched.
So you say that the destruction of temples, then, the kind of summation, the quick summation, is that it was done by Hindu kings,
yes,
as well as Mughal kings,
yes,
as a kind of a political,
as a weapon of war,
as a weapon of war,
as a weapon of war,
but not religiously justified.
No,
that's
the temples were desecrated for political reasons, to decrease the morale or to break the morale of the forces that were fighting them. For example, Hindu kings were doing this to other Hindu states. When they would invade another Hindu state, they would go straight to the temple, break the deity, the idol, and destroy the temple. That would simply finish the war, because the forces, the enemy forces, would lose their morale. Sure. Okay, this point is highlighted in the works of Richard Eaton. Richard Eaton is an authority on temple desecrations, and his work is easily available online. If you Google his name, Richard Eaton, temple desecrations, you will get his articles.
And he presents an entire refutation.
Absolutely.
Well, I'm going to explore that further, but we're just going to go for an ad break, and we'll be back now. Welcome back to I Beg to Differ, and we're engaging in an absolutely fascinating discussion this evening on jihad, on holy terror, so-called Islamic terror, on the history of Muslim civilization in parts of India. And with me back again, Adnan Rashid. Fascinating stuff. You mentioned just before we went Richard Eaton, and I think I want to drive this point down, because Spencer, in his book, well-known Islamophobe, cites K.S. Lal, right, the historian, who utilizes a lot of this information that is drawn directly from a British colonial, writing the British colonial period, and then of course going back to some of the Muslim biographers. We are saying that, fascinating enough, yes, there was temple desecration.
Yes.
But that these temple desecrations were a policy of power, political power, where the particular ruler, albeit Hindu or Muslim, consolidates his power.
Yeah.
And I think one thing we need to also point out is that would I be correct, this is what we were discussing possibly in the break, is that a lot of these Muslim rulers, a lot of their soldiers were Hindus.
Yes.
And a lot of Hindu leaders,
had Muslim
their
soldiers.
were Muslims.
Yes.
So it was not actually a religious policy of destruction, of destroying religious places of worship for religious. It was purely political.
It was a
how do you come to that conclusion? Is that has been the general trend, or how do you come to that conclusion?
Temple desecrations was an Indian phenomenon.
Prior to the Mughals?
100%. Prior to the Mughals, prior to the Muslim appearance in India. The Buddhists were doing it to Hindu temples, the Hindus were doing it to Buddhist temples before the Muslims arrived on the scene. And this phenomenon continued because it is within the Hindu scriptures that the power of the ruler is the deity. If the deity is removed, then the power of the ruler is removed.
So destruction of idols, what did that amount to?
That amounted to the destruction of the state. So it was a bad omen. It was a bad omen.
Was the idol symbolic of power?
Exactly. Just like when you watch this movie Troy, when Achilles lands near Troy, right? He goes straight to the temple, and the first thing he does is he decapitates the statue of Apollo to destroy the morale of the army of Troy. So this is very, very clear in India. In India, this is exactly what's happening. This is exactly...
How long was desecration of temples going on?
For over 1,000 years. For over 1,000 years, yes. Throughout history, throughout known history of India.
In the Vedic period?
Yes, absolutely. There are traces of ancient temples destroyed. Who is destroying them? Before Muslims. So it is not a Muslim phenomenon. It was a strategy of war. It was a military strategy to basically finish the conflict as soon as possible without much casualties. So in war, back in the day, during the Middle Ages, when armies would fight, both armies would be aiming at the king. They would be aiming to kill the leader, the general of the army, or the king himself. Once the king falls from the horse or from his elephant, the war is over. It's over. Likewise, they would aim for the temple. If the deity has been broken and the temple has been desecrated, the war is over. Hence, for that reason, emperors like Aurangzeb Alamgir used this very tactic, which is an Indian tactic, to subdue the enemy as soon as possible. So there
the
were
Babri
certain
Masjid, the Babri Masjid, was that? Give us a bit of the history on that.
the Babri Masjid. It is claimed by the Hindutva movement in India that there was a temple.
Of Ayodhya, but there was no actual temple.
There is no temple. No, there archaeologists have dug underneath, and there is no temple there. So this was a claim made by the Hindu right, to cause problems of Muslims. So this Islamophobia, this hatred of Muslims, and these accusations on the part of the Islamophobes in the US, like Spencer, or in India, like K.S. Lal.
Spencer is now relying primarily on Hindu nationalists, Hindu far right.
Spencer is an opportunist who is an opportunistic prostitute who would
There's
go.
No other better word to describe.
Exactly.
And his partner in crime, Pamela Geller.
Yes.
And Wood and all these other
they are basically living on this movement of hatred. They are simply making money
and borrowed
from hate.
time intellectually, because the entire thesis is totally bankrupt.
Absolutely. Modern. Why am I saying this? Is it because of me? Is it because of me? Is it what I think? No. This is what modern historians think. There is a recent book on Aurangzeb, interestingly. The author is Audrey Trush. She's an American historian. She has written this book on Aurangzeb. And in this book, she provides the incidents whereby Aurangzeb gave money to temples for their repair and gave money to priests, issued orders to his subjects not to harass the Brahmins who worship in their temples. Leave them alone. Do not harass them ever. And he threatened his subjects and his governors and his generals with consequences if they disturb the Brahmins or the temples. So there is this contradiction in Aurangzeb's life. But when you study the history carefully, such as Audrey Trush's book, you will come to realize that when he did desecrate temples, these temples were desecrated because of the village they were in, or because of the city they were in, because these villages or cities had rebelled against the king. So the king invaded this territory, and the easiest way to subdue the enemy was to destroy the idol and desecrate it. On the other hand, there were Hindu generals working for Aurangzeb Alamgir. Under his command, his mansabdars, or his generals or position holders, how can I explain this in the English language? People who held government posts during Aurangzeb's reign, 50 years reign, 31% of them were Hindus.
Wow.
31%, more than all the Mughal kings put together before him. Akbar, Jalaluddin Muhammad Akbar, who apostatized from Islam, is hailed.
Akbar the Great,
Akbar the Great, they call him. And Audrey Trush makes this point that if anyone calls him Akbar the Great, that person simply doesn't know the Mughal history. You don't know what you're talking about. So academics are very interesting. If we read them, modern historians, and they're not Muslim apologists, by the way. They're not Muslim apologists. They simply want to put the record straight, and they are highlighting the absurdity of the Hindutva movement when it comes to history.
The story about Firoz Pasha, is it in Jagannath, which Spencer makes a meal. We listened to that clip. Can you just expand?
Firoz Shah governed in the 14th century in India. He was the son of Muhammad bin Tughlaq, and Ziauddin Barni, who wrote about his campaigns, clearly exaggerated. No one takes Ziauddin Barni's
So Ziauddin Barni is the
historian who was writing about the deeds of Firoz Shah because he wanted to be close to the king, and he paid lavish tributes to him in his own way by highlighting his atrocities against Hindus and others. And Barni, for that reason, is not taken very seriously by modern historians. They highlight that Barni was, again, trying to get close to the king, and he paid these lavish tributes. And these lavish tributes, which were heavily exaggerated, are used by Hindu right-wing elements in India and they're trying to highlight that Muslim period was extremely barbaric, intolerant, and temples were being desecrated, Hindus were being mass murdered. If that's the case, where did the Rajputs come from? Where did the Marathas come from? These were huge powers. Marathas and Rajputs, they couldn't be pushed around. They couldn't be bullied. In fact, there were times when they caused serious problems to the Mughal state because they held very important positions. And when they rebelled, of course, there were wars between them and there were periods of peace and treaties between them. So history is far more nuanced than what Islamophobes and Islam haters
this myth of the genocide of 20 million Hindus. It's totally...
The numbers are impossible.
The numbers are impossible.
Muslims were being killed, Hindus were being killed, Christians were being killed.
If there was a genocide, the Hindu population would not be at the level it is today, with Muslims being still the largest minority.
Some of these
in the
claims
world.
are laughable.
Absolutely laughable.
They are
but they're still there out there in the mainstream media and wanting to be popular.
There's a reason for that, because the mainstream media, as I mentioned earlier, they want to highlight this rhetoric. They want to make this rotten, distorted view of history the norm. This is what they want to present Islam's history as. But this is why we the Muslims need to study our history, understand it in the light of modern academic works, and present it to the world.
And then, of course, rebut these false assumptions.
Absolutely.
And negative stereotypes in respect of what we see out there. Atomization of scripture. We don't have too much of time to that, but that is a kind of a common polemic used against Islam. Surah 9 verse 5, Surah 9 verse 29, Surah 47 verse 4, Surah 8 verse 60. The key passages, I remember some years back doing a debate with Jay Smith on the biblical and Quranic approach to peace and violence. We had the discussion on just simply Quran, the Bible. In the rebuttal session, he never focused on, after seeing the explanations in Surah 9 verse 5 and 929. But some years later, he has a similar debate with Shabir Ali, brings the same point, that even after explaining the context, the historical milieu, what we call the Asbab al-Nuzul, behind many of these passages, it seems to me that atomization of scripture seems to be kind of the norm when it comes to focusing on the Quran and presenting it as inherently violent and calling people to violence.
Quran is a book of law, as we know. It has rules of engagement. Quran has rules.
Primarily a book of guidance.
Yeah, absolutely. A guidance on marriage, guidance on fasting, guidance on prayer, on charity.
It has a just war theory, right?
Absolutely, 100%. And it has rules of engagement. It has rules of conflict. When you are in conflict, you are to do X, Y, and Z. And when these verses are quoted, they are definitely, in most cases, quoted out of context by Islamophobes and missionaries. We are a people who don't like to water down our religion. We cannot lie about Quran and the Sunnah. We have no reason to do that. People are not stupid. The sources are online. All the sources are online. We invite people to go and study a book written by a Muslim scholar on the concept of jihad and on these verses, chapter 9 verse 5, chapter 9 verse 29. All of these verses have context. First of all, chapter 9 verse 5 was revealed about the Qurayshis when they had broken the treaty and they were attacking Muslims, and the Prophet was commanded to retaliate, to fight back.
Very much historically specific, because there were two elements. One were those pagans in Surah 9 verse 4 that had not broken the treaty. You are to deal with them according to the end of the term. Surah 9 verse 5 specifically applicable to those who had broken the treaty. And Surah 9 verse 13 points out the aggravating circumstances. Will you not fight against those who, number one, broke the treaty, violated their oaths, and took the initiative by attacking the Prophet first? So even without the history, from the Quranic perspective itself, the kind of the text and the surrounding context debunks this whole notion. So it seems to me that the underlying motif behind these kind of false assertions, and you've come across them, I think, weekly in Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park, is clearly mischief. Clearly out there to falsehood and out there to paint Muslims in the worst possible light.
Absolutely. The general position of Islam on the non-Muslims is in chapter 60 verse 8. God revealed in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states that with those non-Muslims who do not attack you, they do not attack you. You are to be kind and generous to them.
22 verse 39, same thing, similar thing. Surah 4 verse 75.
Absolutely.
Surah 2 verse 190 again.
Absolutely.
Last 30 seconds. If there's something that you want to advise the Muslim community out there who are facing this onslaught of negative propaganda and certainly extremists who may be engaging in acts of violence, what would your advice be?
My advice is never believe this propaganda. There's no truth in it. Go and study your sources. Pick up any academic book on your history written by an objective historian recognized by a major institution such as Oxford, Cambridge, and you will see the reality of your civilization.
Thank you very much, Adnan. It's been great. A pleasure having you for part 2 of this ongoing discussion. We hope, inshallah, in the future, once you come down back to South Africa from the UK, we'll have you again.
Inshallah.
And that's all we have for this evening. We've had an engaging session on what jihad is, and we've explored other issues on the history of Islam in India, aspects of violence. And join us next week for more hard-hitting, interactive debate and discussion where we look at other issues affecting us as a community. Till next week, this is Yusuf Ismail, on behalf of ITV. Assalamu alaikum and have a good evening.